Hi. This will be a video on my thoughts on eating meat and its effect on people and the moral implications of it. Um, I'll start off by saying that I feel that if a person is to eat meat, then it's better for them, a lot better, morally and otherwise, to buy it meat that's ethically raised, slaughtered. Yeah. Because the reason behind this is because um, I don't know how much, like, any particular one of you, it's going to know about how, what goes into the processing and um, the raising of meat of like the cattle and the pigs and the animals that they use, right? In a general sense, the animals, unless it's ethically raised, and like in order for them to say that it's ethically raised, generally they have to meet, certain guidelines. And if they don't, then they lose that ability. But with that being said, just because something says it's ethically raised, it doesn't necessarily mean that will be, but it just means that it's more likely. And you'd have to know the farm for sure. Um, the farm that comes from, you need to know what's going on and stuff. But anyway, the reason being is why it's better to eat meat, if you eat meat anyway, that's ethically raised and slaughtered and all that, is because the meats that generally is sold, the animals are generally tortured and abused their whole lives. Their whole lives. They're tortured and abused. And the reality is that a lot of the people that work at those places, I'm not saying everyone who works at those places is, but those kind of places, they're so dark, and like the energy in there, it's so black, like it's pretty. Think about like the energy that you'd have like at a place like that, a slaughterhouse where they raise like the vast majority of animals, right, for meat that isn't ethically produced. You a lot of those places attract psychopaths and sociopaths. In a lot of cases, they'll abuse the animals, like abuse them like really badly. Like I've known people that have worked in those places in the past, and it made them sick. Some of the things that they saw, and like they'll abuse the chickens, the cows, the pigs, all that stuff, and they'll hit them and kick them and beat them, and scare the shit out of them, and basically just like terrorize them. Like chicken catchers, they'll pick chickens up by their necks and stuff like that, and um, it's really sick treatment. And essentially, and also in these places, they're packed. Like they'll have a barn, and they'll place like 100 animals, or they'll have a small barn, and they'll place like 100 animals in there, so they don't even have room to like move. They're all like so packed that it's like they're all like up each other's ass essentially. Yeah. And that's how they have to live. They'll they'll occupy those quarters, and they'll be stacked in there for like 8 hours of the day, and then they'll be put into another space where they're packed together pretty much almost as tightly for the rest of the day, right? So basically, they aren't given any space to move. They aren't given any space to breathe. You know, their diet is bad, like cows. Um, they're meant to be fed on grass, but generally, the most meat that's produced, the non-ethically raised kind anyway, especially, like they'll be fed corn, which isn't really good for cows. You know, So that alone, that diet change, makes them less happy and more anxious and more miserable, essentially, because they're not cows. They're not built to, eat only corn. You know. But beyond that, like I said, the living spaces, they're packed. They're jam packed. If you don't believe me, watch a documentary on like meat production, or read a book on it. Read books on it. The information is out there if you do a bit of digging on what goes into it and like the conditions that those animals live in. And yeah, it's pretty much hell. They're all packed into like a tight space, no room to breathe. They're all up each other's asses. Think about it yourselves. If you were like, if you had to live every day of your life, you know, in a barn packed with like 100 other people, and you're all like packed in so tightly together, that you could barely even move. How would you like that? I don't know. I can't speak for anyone else, but I wouldn't like it. That would be pretty like, jeez. Yeah, I wouldn't like that at all. I don't think any, I don't think any normal human being would. I don't think animals would either. I don't think any normal animal would either, whether they're a cow or a pig or a chicken. And beyond that, they're abused. Like I said, a lot of those places attract psychopaths and sociopaths, because no one, there's some people that are, somewhat normal that work in those places, but, for the most part, most of them are sick people, because no one normal would want to work in those places. It's filled with death and misery. And, anyone who owns pets realizes that animals have emotions. Anyone that owns pets realizes that. So, those animals have emotions, and they're being abused. They're being hit. They're being tortured. They're being, they'll be scared. A lot of the workers there, they'll use fear to, make them more submissive and docile, right? You'll use violence. And their living conditions, as I said, are like disgusting. So essentially, like the majority of the animals that are raised for meat, they live lives that are hellacious, a living hell. They're tortured from the moment that they're born to the moment that they die. And the sad part is that even when in their death, they're not even, in a lot of cases, they're slaughtered in ways that are inhumane and cruel. So, and why is that done? Well, because it's a little bit more efficient. It saves a few bucks on their balance sheet. It helps the bottom line. That's why. Because some of the people, like I said, that work there, they're sick people. At those places. So, like I said, with like how they're killed in really inhumane ways, like really inhumane, in ways that are pretty terrible deaths. So, for one, like I said, they're tortured from the moment they're born until the moment they die. Their whole life is torture. And then finally, at the end, you'd think that they'd at least, give them a peaceful death. You'd think that at least like the people that own those places, right, would give them that much respect. Another living being, you know what I mean? Like compassion, right? They give them a life of torture, misery, and hell. And they can't even, they don't even have the decency to give them, a proper death. They don't even have the decency to give them a merciful death. These animals that they're raising for meat and selling, you know. So in a spiritual sense, think about that for a second. What kind of energy do you think an animal that's been abused and tortured its whole life is going to possess? If you believe like in energy and in energies or like spirituality or any of this stuff, right? If you're watching this, then I imagine you might. If you believe in any of that stuff, like energies and stuff like that, what kind of energy do you think an animal that's been tortured its whole life, abused its whole life, who's been scared, terrified, uncomfortable, anxious, hurt its whole life, from the moment it's born to the moment it dies? What kind of energy do you think an animal like that would have by the time it's packaged as meat? What kind of energy do you think that meat would possess? Do you think it'd be a positive energy? Do you think it'd be like a sunshine and lollipops and stuff like that, right? I don't think so. You see, everything, the food that we consume, it all has an energy to it, and obviously, different species, different types of foods, like a zucchini versus a watermelon, they're going to have a different energy just based on their different types of plants, right? And different species of animals would have different energies too, right? But there'd be different energies in between each species as well. Like for cows, there'd be a different energy between a cow that's ethically raised and a cow that is not ethically raised. Its meat would have a different energy in a spiritual sense, right? See, a cow that would be ethically raised, and ethically, slaughtered and all that, it would have a less negative and a lot less negative in energy, because it's, if it's ethically raised, it's at least lived a life where it's, that hasn't been miserable. It doesn't necessarily mean that the life it lived was good, but it does mean that at least it wasn't miserable, and at least it wasn't torture, probably. And at least it probably had at least a peaceful death and a merciful death. That animal, that cow. So the beef that cow is packaged into, it would carry an energy that's a lot more positive than a cow that was tortured from the day it was born to the day it died, and that wasn't even given a merciful or peaceful death. It wasn't even given that, it wasn't even given that, it wasn't even given that privilege, And this is a spiritual talk, right? It's a spiritual talk. It's about energies and all this stuff, right? That's vague, right? But there's scientific basis to this too. Beyond that, the reality is that animals that are raised in conditions that are bad, they're going to have an abundance of stress hormones and, you know, neurotransmitters that are, you know, that are negative, you know, basically, you know, because that all goes into the beef. That all goes into the meat that the animal produces, right? That's produced from the animal. All those hormones, all those stress hormones. So think about an animal, one cow who's raised ethically, and the other cow who's raised, well, raised like most cows are, which is torture. What do you think the hormonal profile of the cow who, you know, is raised ethically is going to be compared to the hormonal profile of the cow that's tortured? Do you think they're going to have the same amount of stress hormones in the beef that each produces, that's produced from each animal? Do you think they're going to have the same amount of stress hormones? Do you think they're still going to have the same amount of positive hormones? They could. Who knows, right? You know, pigs can fly, right? You know. So the reality is that when people eat the majority of the meat that's raised, and by raised I mean tortured, they're eating an extreme amount of stress hormones. An extreme amount of stress hormones. Because that animal has done nothing but produce an abnormally high amount of stress hormones and negative, like bad neurotransmitters since the day it was born until the day it died. It's been doing nothing really but producing an abnormally high amount of stress hormones and negative, you know, brain chemicals and all that stuff, right? From the moment it's born to the day it dies. An amount of stress hormones that's so high, it's like it'd be off the charts. Think about an animal who is living in the wild, right? And sure, animals, when they're living in the wild, they get stressed too because, you know, they have natural predators and all that stuff, right? You know, and all that jazz, you know. But in the wild, the animals can actually roam around. They can go where they want, you know. Sure, you know, they have to worry about predators, but, you know, at least they have a chance of making it out, you know. They don't have a chance of making it out against the predators that they have in the, you know, in the slaughterhouses that they're raised in. None of them make it out. You know? So an animal in the wild, it wouldn't produce anywhere near the amount of stress hormones or like negative neurotransmitters, negative, you know, brain chemicals, stuff like that. It wouldn't produce anywhere near the amount of, you know, negative chemical reactions that an animal that's raised for meat generally would be. You know. So what does that mean? Back in the day, you know, when people used to eat meat, you know, they'd hunt generally, right? For most of our history, we'd hunt. Farming is a new invention, a very new invention. I think farming came around maybe 10,000 years ago, maybe a bit before that. I don't know. It hasn't been around long. For most of our evolutionary past as human beings, we've been hunter-gatherers. For the vast majority of our past as human beings, we've been hunter-gatherers. So for the majority of our time, we hunted animals in the wild when they were, you know, where would be a lot happier. a lot happier than, being stuffed, 100 of them all up each other's asses in a single barn. They literally have watched documentaries on this stuff. They're out there. Um, their conditions and stuff. You know, they're given no space. They'll cram literally as many as they can in there. You know, it's like cramming, 2 people or 3 people in a phone booth. Remember those phone booths? I do. But you know you're old when. But anyway, yeah. So that's what we did throughout most of our evolutionary past. We hunted animals that are like 100 times, that were 100 times happier than the animals that most people eat for meat. 100 times happier. That produce nowhere near the amount of stress hormones or negative, chemical reactions based off stress that the animals produce, most of them anyway, the non-ethically raised ones produce now. And farming, like I said, farming is a relatively recent invention in human history. Farming is somewhere around 10,000 years old, somewhere around there. Don't quote me on it, but it's somewhere around there. It's relatively recent invention. It's not, for most, like I said, for the vast majority of our history, we've been hunter-gatherers. You know. But with farming, for the most part, farming was a lot more ethical back in the day, or it was at least a lot less it was less capitalistic, you know. It was more so, it was something that was done in small communities, right? Rather than the corporate endeavor that it is now. You know, what does that mean? That means essentially that the animals that were raised back then, they didn't, do all these sick things to, save a few bucks, to make the bottom line look better. You know, they didn't do that as much. They did stuff like 100 cows inside a small barn. Yeah, they actually gave them some space to roam in. That's how farming was generally done. They gave their animals space to roam in, and they generally fed them grass. The cows, they fed the animals actual like food that they're supposed to eat, rather than corn because it's cheaper. It saves space because it takes space for to grow a cow to grow grass, and then to have cows graze at it. You know, when you feed them corn, you don't really have to have much space, do you? You just throw them in the fucking barn, off each other's asses and feed them corn, right? So it's cheaper. It's less space, See, back in the day when people farmed, they generally had, ranges and stuff like that, so that they'd at least give them space to roam, you know, and they'd at least give them, their natural food, like they give the cows grass and stuff like that, right? And moreover, you know, the farmers, would be, they'd be in the community, right? So their farms would be, adjacent to other farms and other, properties and stuff like that. And, the communities are smaller, so everyone knew each other, right? So the farmers would treat the animals with more respect. Because if other people in the community saw them, fucking torturing their animals and just fucking treating them, like, beating them and fucking treating them like absolute shit and like pushing them all in like a single small barn, And then the other people in the community would be like, I don't know. Maybe we'll buy from the other guy, right? So, and moreover, people, farmers, they just had more respect for their animals back then. Like nowadays, these meat processing places, they're not really farms. They're just fucking meat processing factories, essentially. It's like a lot of things that are corporately that have been taken over by corporate interests. It's essentially, it's lost a lot of the soul that the industry used to have, right? And when an industry, and it's one thing to lose a soul, for an industry to lose its soul, when it becomes corporately owned or corporately controlled, right? It's one thing for one industry to lose its soul when that happens, but it's another when, something like meat production loses its soul. Because already that was something that was kind of, a bit of a more of a gray area, right? You know, but so essentially, like in the past, for most of our history, when we farmed, the animals were treated better. They were under nowhere near the amount of stress that they're under now. Nowhere near. They didn't produce anywhere near the amount of like stress hormones and negative, chemical reactions in their bodies throughout their lives. They weren't tortured from the moment that they were born to the moment they died. And the farmers, that farmed back then, they generally they treated their animals with better respect than they do now. Because the people that work in those places and those meat processing plants, they're not even farms anymore. Those things, they're just meat processing plants. The people there, like I said, a lot of them were psychopaths and sociopaths, because it'd be hard for a person with a heart to go into one of those places and see how they're being treated. I sure as fuck wouldn't want to go. I've heard some. I've looked into it. And I was like, holy fuck. It's like, I wouldn't want to go into one of those places. They couldn't pay me fucking enough to go into one of those places. I don't know which I'd rather do. If a person pointed a gun to my head and said, you have to tour the death camps, or you have to, go into one of those meat processing plants, I'm not sure which one I'd rather do. I'm not sure which one I'd rather do least. I know for sure one thing, that if I went to either of those places, I'd want to puke, like the second I walked in there. I know for sure that if I went to any one of those places, that I would puke the second I walked out. And probably I'd puke when I was in there too. Because I have a heart, right? And I feel empathy for, other living beings, right? And I think, even people that eat meat from those places, I used to too. I used to eat meat. I'm not vegan. I eat dairy and milk and stuff like that. But no one would want to see that. Even the people that eat that stuff wouldn't want to see it. When I ate it, I didn't want to see it. And then I was given some information about it. I was like, holy fuck. And I thought about it for a while, and I never felt the same after hearing about that, eating meat again. And then I quit eventually. And So, my view on meat, a spiritual view on meat, is that the energy from it is bad. It's negative. Essentially, in a spiritual sense, you're eating an animal that's been tortured from the day it's been born till the day it's died. And a lot of them, they're not even given the respect of being given peaceful death or a merciful death. So when they die, they produce a lot more stress hormones just by their mode of death than they would um, than they would if they were slaughtered in a way that was more humane. So that too adds to the more amount of stress hormones and more amount of negative energy and more amount of negative chemicals inside the body that's produced by stress, right? Because people, we produce, based on how stressed or happy we are. Our bodies produce different chemicals based on that. Our brains and our bodies, our nervous systems, all that stuff in conjunction, our gut, it's based, a person, you take the same person, all other factors being equal, and say a clone, they're clones, okay? So they're exactly the same age, same height, same genetic structure, all that stuff, right? Now, you take them, those clones, right? And I don't know, you give one of them circumstances that makes them like super happy, right? For the next 5 years. And he's just super happy, right? And then you take the other clone and give them circumstances that makes them like super miserable over the next 5 years. Do you think that their bodies are still going to have the same chemistry and same hormonal profile and same chemical structure based on the neurotransmitters and the balances between them and all that, all those various factors after 5 years? Do you think the miserable person is going to have the same chemistry as his super happy clone after 5 years? If you understand anything about epigenetics, no way. Jeez Louise. Like, oh God. No way. After 5 years, the one person, the miserable one, would have stress hormones that are way higher. Way higher. And they'd have positive hormones that are lower. And, their hormonal and neurotransmitter balances would be completely different. Like the miserable person would have a lot more cortisol. They'd likely have less serotonin, less dopamine, all those factors, right? And the happier person would have more dopamine, more serotonin, blah, blah, blah. And there's a lot of other neurotransmitters and stuff. It's a lot more complicated than dopamine and serotonin and cortisol, okay? I'm just basically making it, simplifying it so that it's easier to understand, right? But so too is it with an animal. An animal that's miserable its whole life is going to have a completely different chemical profile and hormonal than an animal that's happy for most of its life, or at least not miserable. Completely different. They're not even going to be comparable, even if they're clones of each other. It's the old nature versus nurture argument. Yeah, there's something to nature, right? Like the genetics of things, but there's nurture too. They're both important. So in a scientific sense, what do you think would happen to a person, when they eat all these, negative hormones and chemicals, right? from an animal that's been tortured its whole life? Do you think eating all that cortisol would make a person calmer? Do you think it'd make them happier? Do you think it'd make them feel more at peace within themselves? I don't really think it would. Yeah. And moreover, even beyond that, even beyond the scientific, you know, the scientific, the scientific arguments of it, and the scientific argument is obvious. An animal that's been raised ethically is, likely gonna, if a person is eating it, it's likely gonna have less of a negative effect on them, on their mind state, and their emotions, than an animal that's been tortured. It's pretty obvious. Like, it's not rocket science. You don't need to be Einstein to figure it out. To put two and two together, right? But even beyond that, in a spiritual sense, in an energetic sense, like I said, what kind of energy do you think would be attached to an animal or inside an animal? Because it would be inside, right? Because its meat is what's being processed, which is its body, right? So its body is still going to hold those energetic imprints that were molded into it via its upbringing and its life. It's going to hold those energetic imprints. The meat that produces good is going to hold those energetic imprints. It's the meat that produces is going to actually be like a perfect, it's going to be like a perfect storehouse for those energetic imprints. The torture, the abuse, the fear, the anxiety, the stress, all of that, the depression, all of that. It's gonna be in its meat. So in a spiritual sense, when a person eats that, they're taking on those negative emotions. They're taking on those negative energies. They're taking on that fear. They're taking on that stress. They're taking on that anxiety. They're taking on that feeling of hopelessness that those animals had to suffer throughout their entire lives. And, that's going to affect people. It's going to, even a person who isn't sensitive to that stuff, it's going to affect them. It'll affect some people more subtly than others. Like some people it'll affect heavily. It depends on how sensitive, the person is. But it'll affect some people in a more subtle way. But it'll affect everyone who eats that. Guaranteed. So with that being said, my view on meat is that if you eat it, it's better to, in a spiritual sense, and also, like I said, in a scientific sense as well, because you don't want to you don't want to, you know, it's probably not the best idea, you know, regardless of all the spiritual mumbo jumbo that I'm talking about right now. It's, you know, even regardless of that, it's probably, you know, thinking about it, it's probably not the best idea to eat, you know, a cortisol burger. You know, cortisol burger. I don't know. I don't know, Timmy. Maybe a serotonin burger, but cortisol. I don't know if I need any more of that. Come on, jeez. Mm. Yeah, like even in a scientific sense, if you think about it for a few seconds, you know, it's obvious, right? So my view on meat is that if you eat it, it's better to eat ethically raised meat, because then at least, and that's not only in a spiritual sense, but that's in a scientific sense as well. Because like I said, who in their right mind wants to eat a cortisol burger? You know? And granted, you know, lots of people eat burgers and fucking, um, they're fine with eating a cortisol burger, you know, but some of those people, a lot of those people, they don't really know, they never had this explained to them. You know, once a person has something like this explained to them, then there's like, oh, well, that makes sense. Yeah, they would produce all those fucking stress hormones. And I'm eating that. Oh, you know, it's just, you know, it's just, once you get, you know, an idea and you get some illumination on something, then you're just like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense now, you know? So, you know, there's lots of people that like burgers and all that stuff. That's fine, you know, but once you realize, you know, what goes into it, and, you know, the potential negative repercussions it could have, you know, eating a cortisol burger, you know what I mean? It just, you know, and a lot of people these days, they're unhappy, you know, they're depressed, you know, they're anxious, you know, they're stressed, you know, and sad, you know, and people, you know, we have all this, you know, all these opportunities and all these things now, all these gadgets and stuff. But people, you know, we're less happy than we've ever been. Maybe that's contributing to it. That's one factor, I think, that would be contributing to it, right? I think. You know. But yeah, I think that not only in a scientific sense or, you know, physical or material or, you know, sense, that I think that eating ethically raised is better, way better. But not only that, but in a spiritual sense, it's obvious. Because in a spiritual sense, you're basically eating organic, corn-fed suffering and pain. Every time you eat that, right? So, yeah, that's what I think. Yeah, and that's what I have to say. That's my spiritual opinion and my uh, more rational opinion too on meat and, you know, what it does, and the moral and practical significations of eating it. Um, because I mean, even beyond the effect that it has on a person who's eating it, like think about it. Now that you know, like, saw this stuff, and like I said, if you don't believe me how they're treated, the majority of those animals that aren't ethically raised, look into it. It won't take you long to fucking to see the truth. You know. So like even beyond, like, my whole argument tonight has been based on, you know, the effects that would have on people eating it. And yes, it would have effects on people eating it. And the effects would be subtle at best. At best. At worst, they would be extreme. in that, like, if, like, for instance, a person who eats meat who may be, stressed and anxious and, depressed, you know, well, if they're eating non-ethically raised meat, then that could be like a big contributor to it, especially if they're sensitive. And they may not even know it, right? But like I said, the arguments that I've made thus far, it's been all like rational. It's been all based on more so, well, not all rational. Some of it's spiritual, right? But it's even the spiritual stuff is rational in a spiritual sense, right? But what I mean is that the arguments that I've made so far, it's based on the effect that would have on the people consuming it. That's been my whole argument so far. It's the effect that it would have on the people consuming it. And I stand by that it definitely would have an effect. But beyond that, let's say that didn't have any effect one way or another if you ate an ethically raised animal versus a non-ethically raised animal. Let's say that it didn't make a difference. Let's say that for a second, hypothetically. Well, even if that were the case, this is a spiritual topic, right? This is a spiritual channel, so what do you think the moral implications are of eating an animal and contributing to something that's been raised from the moment it's been born, tortured, violated, abused? It's another living being, right? Yeah. So those are my thoughts on meat. I'm not like one of those like crazy vegan people who like try to, shove their shit down everyone's throat, right? I'm not even vegan myself, but I'm just vegetarian. But I eat fish oil, I guess. Whatever. But with that being said, I'm not saying, oh, you should be vegan or you should be vegetarian or anything like that. I'm not saying that. I'm not telling people what to do or anything like that. I'm just giving people advice. I'm just giving my opinion and the truth from a moral, from a scientific, and from a spiritual viewpoint. And, if a person wants to eat meat, that's their choice, But what I'm saying is that if they do, in a spiritual sense, it's hard to call yourself a spiritual person if you're contributing to another living being's torture and abuse. It's hard. Moreover, like I said, it will affect anyone who eats an animal that's put through that. And the effect isn't going to be positive. So, yeah. Those are my thoughts on meat. Take it or leave it, but it is what it is. Signing off.